The poor rancher saved two giant Apache twins. That night, they whispered they wanted him together. John Calder was a man shaped by the land he lived on. His ranch lay on the edge of the Arizona desert, where the sun painted the sky orange and gold every morning, only to scorch the earth relentlessly by midday. The winds here were constant, sweeping across the sparse plains, carrying dust, tumbleweeds, and sometimes the faint cries of coyotes in the distance. Life was never easy for John, and it had never promised to be. Every day was a struggle, a battle to keep his ranch alive, his family fed, and his spirit unbroken. John's ranch was modest, a small cluster of wooden structures that had seen better days. The main house leaned slightly to one side, and the paint had long faded to a dusty beige. A few barns and pens held what little livestock John could afford: some cattle, a couple of horses, and a few chickens. Water was always scarce, and the land around him was dry and stubborn, refusing to grow much more than patches of hardy grass. But John loved this land. He knew every rock, every dry creek, every thorny bush. It was a hard life, yes, but it was honest. His mornings began before the sun had fully risen. John would step outside, feeling the cool night air still clinging to the desert, and listen to the quiet before the world fully woke. He often walked the fields first, checking on the cattle, making sure none had wandered too far. Some mornings he would find footprints in the soft dirt that didn't belong to any of his animals, tracks of foxes or rabbits, perhaps, though sometimes he wondered if something larger had passed through. On this particular morning, John was moving slowly. He had worked late the night before, repairing a fence that had fallen after a strong windstorm. His arms ached, and his back protested as he bent and lifted. But he had learned long ago that complaining didn't help. His family depended on him, and giving up was never an option. He had an aging mother, Grace, who still maintained her small garden near the house, and a younger sister, Lucy, who helped with chores whenever she could. They were all that John had, and their trust in him fueled every drop of energy he could muster. As John walked toward the far end of his property near a dry creek that ran only when rain came, he heard something unusual. At first it was faint, a soft, desperate sound that made him stop in his tracks. The wind had shifted, carrying the sound toward him more clearly. It was a cry for help, a voice trembling with fear, though oddly heavy, as if it came from someone much larger than a normal person. John's heart quickened. He had lived in these lands long enough to recognize the difference between ordinary wildlife sounds and human distress. Without a second thought, he followed the noise, his boots crunching over the dry, cracked earth. The creek bed was shallow but wide, flanked by jagged rocks and scrubby bushes. As he approached, the cries grew louder, more urgent, and then he saw them. Two enormous figures were tangled in a net, their arms and legs struggling, their faces twisted in pain and panic. They were unlike anyone John had ever seen. The locals often told stories of the Apache giants, legendary twins said to roam these lands centuries ago, though most dismissed them as folklore. Yet here they were, right before his eyes, enormous and strong, yet clearly vulnerable. The net, thick and cruelly woven, had ensnared them, and despite their size, they couldn't free themselves. John's first instinct was fear. It was not every day that a man stumbled upon beings of such legend. But that fear quickly gave way to compassion. He remembered his mother's words, spoken long ago when he was a boy. We cannot turn away from someone in need, no matter how strange or frightening they seem. He had always taken those words to heart, and today they guided him. "Hold on!" he called, his voice firm but steady. "I'll get you out of there." The twins froze momentarily. their wide eyes fixed on him. One of them, taller and slightly older looking, gave a hesitant nod. The other's expression softened, relief flickering across his face as if he knew John meant no harm. John approached carefully, assessing the net. It was thick and rough, designed to trap even the strongest of creatures. He grabbed a sturdy rock and began cutting at the ropes, chipping away at the heavy knots. The twins stayed still, letting him work, their immense muscles taut with effort and frustration. John's hands ached as he labored, but he refused to stop. He had saved many animals before, and though this was far more dangerous, he knew he could not abandon them. After what felt like hours, though it was likely only minutes, the ropes finally gave way. The twins stepped free, their enormous feet stirring dust and small stones. They stretched their limbs, testing muscles that had been trapped too long, and then turned to John. Neither spoke at first. They simply looked at him, their eyes reflecting gratitude, curiosity, and something else. Something unspoken, but deeply felt. John felt a shiver run down his spine. He had helped them, yes, but he sensed that their presence on his land would change everything. You helped us," one of them finally said, his voice deep and resonant. "Few would." John shrugged, brushing dust from his coat. "I couldn't just leave you there," he said simply. "Anyone trapped deserves help." The twins exchanged a glance, then nodded. They didn't offer more words, but John understood enough. Their eyes said it all. "We remember this. We will not forget." By the time the sun was high, John had guided the twins toward the safer areas of the ranch. They moved with surprising grace, despite their size, and John marveled at the sheer power contained within their bodies. The locals had told stories of the Apache giants being nearly unstoppable in battle, but here they were, gentle giants caught in a moment of helplessness. That night, John sat by the fire in his small kitchen, feeling the weight of the day settle into his bones. He thought about the twins, wondering where they had come from and where they would go. There was a tension in the air, a quiet sense that his life had shifted in a way he could not yet understand. He cleaned his tools slowly, careful not to make noise, yet feeling as though the desert itself was watching him. Outside, the wind whispered through the rocks and bushes. And in that whisper, John thought he heard soft voices, almost too faint to distinguish, speaking words he could not quite catch. He paused, listening. But the desert was still once more. His imagination, perhaps, he told himself. Or maybe the giants were thanking him from afar, in their own mysterious way. As he went to bed that night, exhaustion tugging at him, John could not shake the feeling that something extraordinary had begun. The twins were free, yes, but he sensed that their connection to him had only just started. He had always known life on the ranch would be difficult, but he had never imagined it could be this strange, this magical, this alive. In the quiet darkness, John whispered a small prayer, not for wealth or fame, but for the safety of those he had helped. Little did he know that this act of courage and kindness would ripple through the coming nights, leading to events that would change his life forever. And as he drifted into sleep, he dreamt of the twins' enormous forms moving silently through the desert, watching over him with a protective care he could not yet fully comprehend. For John Calder, the poor rancher with little but his land and family, that day had begun like any other. Yet it ended with a promise, one whispered on the wind, that kindness, even in the harshest of places, could forge bonds beyond imagination. And tomorrow, he knew, would bring more than the scorching sun and the dry plains. It would bring wonder. The next morning, the Arizona sun rose slowly, casting a golden light over John Calder's small ranch. The dry wind rustled through the sparse trees and bushes, carrying the scent of earth and dust, and for a moment, everything seemed calm. But John knew better. Something extraordinary had happened yesterday, something he couldn't yet understand. The memory of the enormous figures trapped in the net lingered in his mind, their eyes so wide and alive, staring at him with a mixture of fear and trust. John moved through his morning routine with unusual care. He fed the cattle and chickens, repaired a gate that had started to sag, and carried water from the well. Yet each time he glanced toward the distant creek bed, a small flicker of anticipation stirred in his chest. He wondered if the twins had returned. He hoped, almost instinctively, that they would. By midday, he had almost convinced himself that the figures of yesterday were gone forever, mere shadows of his imagination brought on by exhaustion. He was bending over to mend a broken fence post when a sudden movement caught his eye. At first, it looked like the shadow of a large bird, but then the shadow grew and stretched in impossible ways. John froze. The hair on his arms prickled as the figures came into view. The giants were back. They were enormous, just as they had appeared yesterday, towering over the tallest horses, their muscles thick and strong, yet they moved with surprising gentleness. John's heart pounded in his chest. Part of him wanted to run, to hide in his house, but another part, the stronger part, knew he could not. He had helped them once. He could not turn away now. "Hello," John called, his voice steady despite the fear fluttering inside him. "It's safe here. You don't have to be afraid." The twins stopped in their tracks, tilting their heads as if trying to understand his words. One of them, the taller of the two, stepped forward slowly. His eyes, dark and deep, studied John carefully. Then, as if recognizing the man who had freed them, a small nod of acknowledgement passed between them. John realized they weren't dangerous, at least not in the way people usually feared things they did not understand. They were beings of strength and legend, yes, but they were also alive with curiosity and intelligence. Their presence was powerful, almost overwhelming, yet there was a quiet vulnerability in their stance, a subtle reminder that even the mighty could be trapped or in need. He took a cautious step forward, keeping his hands visible. "Do you need food? Water? Not dead?" "Anything?" he asked, though he wasn't sure if they understood him fully. The twins didn't answer. Instead, the smaller one slowly knelt near the ground and touched a patch of dirt, feeling its texture as if discovering it for the first time. John watched, fascinated. Every movement was deliberate, almost ritualistic, and he felt both fear and wonder swirling in his chest. The taller twin finally spoke, his voice low but clear, rumbling like distant thunder. We are trapped once more," he said, though the words were heavy, as if the meaning carried more than what he could express. John's brow furrowed. Trapped? How? He asked, unsure if the answer would make sense. The twin gestured toward the old rocks by the creek. "The hunters. They set nets to catch us." "Again," he said slowly. "We escaped. Barely." John's anger flared, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had faced harsh weather, scarcity, and isolation, but cruelty toward any living being, human or otherwise, filled him with a deep sense of injustice. He knew he had to help them, not just out of kindness, but out of necessity. If these giants were trapped again, no one else could free them. "Come with me," John said, motioning toward his ranch. "There is food, water, and safety." "You won't be hurt here." The twins hesitated for a moment. Their eyes flicked to the surrounding desert, the endless horizon, and the possibility of escape. Then, slowly, As if trusting a force stronger than fear, they followed him. John led them to a small, shaded area behind his house where he had stacked extra hay and maintained a water trough. He set out large bowls of water and some bread and vegetables he had saved from his own meager stores. They approached cautiously. The giants examined the food with wide, curious eyes, picking up a piece of bread as if it were a rare treasure. They ate slowly, deliberately, as if tasting and remembering every flavor. John watched, fascinated. These were creatures of legend, yet here they were, eating simply, needing sustenance like anyone else. He realized that kindness, a simple act of giving food and water, could bridge worlds. After they had eaten, the twins lay down near the shade, their enormous bodies folding awkwardly into the space. They did not sleep as humans did. Instead, their eyes stayed half open, scanning the surroundings with alertness. John felt a mixture of awe and humility. He had freed them, yet he knew their presence was not just about gratitude. Something deeper was unfolding. The afternoon passed slowly. John tended to chores, keeping one eye on the twins. He noticed small, peculiar behaviors. One of the giants traced patterns in the dirt with his fingers, while the other seemed to study the way the sunlight fell across the land. They were learning, observing, and perhaps trying to understand him as much as he was trying to understand them. As evening approached, a quiet tension settled over the ranch. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in oranges and purples. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and dust, and the desert grew cooler. John lit a small fire outside, hoping to provide warmth. The giants watched the flames silently, their faces reflecting curiosity and an unspoken intelligence. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, almost drowned by the crackle of the fire, but John could hear them clearly. The twins were speaking to each other, words too soft for him to understand fully. Yet the tone, the cadence, carried meaning, gratitude, wonder, and something else. Something like a bond forming. John leaned back on his heels, mesmerized. He realized that this was not just a rescue. This was the beginning of a connection that went beyond fear, beyond legend, beyond ordinary life. The night deepened. The stars appeared one by one, bright and clear in the desert sky. John felt a strange comfort sitting near the fire, knowing these enormous beings were close, alive, and trusting him. He could not have imagined this when he woke that morning. He had expected a day of routine chores and quiet labor, yet he had stumbled into a story that seemed lifted from folklore. As the wind rustled through the dry bushes, John noticed the twins' eyes occasionally meeting his. There was intelligence in those eyes, a recognition that went deeper than simple thanks. He felt as if they were trying to communicate something unspoken, a message carried by presence, gesture, and silence, rather than words. Before long, John realized that the twins were not going to leave. They had been free once, yes, but now they lingered. He understood that they had chosen to stay nearby, at least for the moment. And in that choice, there was trust. Something about the life he had led, humble, honest, and kind, had drawn them to him. It was a bond forged in necessity, yes, but also in respect and human decency. The fire dwindled, casting long shadows across the ground. John stood, stretching his tired muscles, and glanced at the twins one last time before heading inside. Their forms were immense, resting in the shade, but he could sense their watchfulness. The desert night was silent except for the occasional rustle of a distant animal, and yet the presence of the giants made it feel alive in a way John had never experienced before. That night, as John lay on his narrow bed, he thought about the day's events. He thought about the courage it had taken to approach beings so unlike anything else he had ever known. He thought about the trust they had placed in him and the responsibility that came with it. And most of all, he thought about the strange, almost magical connection that had begun to form, a bond that would change the course of his life in ways he could not yet imagine. Sleep came slowly, but even in dreams, John could feel their presence. The giants moved silently through the desert, protective, watchful, and patient. He woke with a sense of anticipation, knowing that this was only the beginning. Their story together, of survival, trust, and perhaps friendship, had just begun. And John Calder, the poor rancher, understood that life on the edge of the desert would never be ordinary again. The days that followed were unlike any John Calder had ever known. The sun rose and fell as it always had, painting the desert in the familiar oranges, reds, and golds. But life on the ranch felt different. There was a quiet energy in the air, a presence that John could feel even if he couldn't see it all the time. The twins, enormous and silent in the daylight, had stayed close to the ranch, moving through the fields, studying the land, and occasionally observing John as he worked. At first, John had tried to go about his daily chores as if nothing had changed. He fed the cattle, repaired fences, and collected water from the well, but the giant's presence made every task feel strangely significant. Each step he took, each animal he tended to, seemed to be observed by those massive, watchful eyes. He realized that he could no longer separate the ordinary rhythm of life from the extraordinary events unfolding on his property. One morning, John noticed something unusual. A pile of rocks he had stacked near the edge of the creek the day before was no longer in the same arrangement. It wasn't scattered by wind or animals. The rocks had been carefully moved, stacked into a neat formation that seemed deliberate, almost symbolic. John bent down to examine them and saw markings etched into the stones, simple patterns that were strange but strangely beautiful. He traced them with his fingers, feeling the smooth edges and faint grooves. He had no idea how the giants had managed it without speaking, but he understood one thing. They were trying to communicate. The twins, enormous and gentle, had begun leaving subtle signs of their presence around the ranch. Tracks appeared where none should exist, huge footprints pressed into the soft earth, sometimes circling the house, other times leading to the fields. Tools he had set down in the morning would be neatly rearranged by evening. On more than one occasion, John had returned from a short walk to find the water trough filled to the brim, though he had not done it himself. At first, these signs startled him. He had lived a long life on the ranch, accustomed to solitude and hard work. But now there was magic in the air, a quiet enchantment that made him both uneasy and deeply curious. John began speaking to the giants, even though he knew they might not respond in the way humans did. "Are you watching me?" he asked one afternoon, while repairing a fence with sweat pouring down his face. The taller twin stepped close, towering over him, and for a moment their eyes met. There was understanding there, silent and unspoken, and John felt a warmth spread through his chest. He realized that the giants were not just observing him, they were learning from him, perhaps even learning to trust him fully. Days passed, and the twins' behaviors grew more intriguing. At night, when the desert became cool and still, John would hear faint whispers, soft enough that he had to strain to listen. The words were not always clear, but the tone carried emotion, curiosity, care, and a sense of protection. Sometimes he could hear them speaking to each other in low tones, discussing things he could not understand. And yet, there was a rhythm to it, almost musical, that made him feel included in their world, even though he could not grasp their language fully. One night, after the fire had burned down to glowing embers, John felt a strange tug at his heart. He stepped outside and saw the twins standing together near the edge of the ranch, their enormous forms silhouetted against the starlit sky. The desert was quiet except for the faint rustle of the wind. One of the giants slowly raised a hand, pointing toward the horizon, and John followed the gesture with his eyes. Far off in the distance, the faint glow of another settlement flickered, reminding him of the world beyond his ranch. It was then he understood something important. The twins were not just visitors. They were aware of the world around them, of dangers and threats, of kindness and cruelty, and yet they had chosen to remain here, close to him, because of the trust he had shown them. John felt a swell of gratitude in his chest. It was a rare thing, he thought, to earn the loyalty of beings so extraordinary. Despite their size and strength, the twins were gentle with his family. Lucy had begun to help more around the ranch, and at first she was frightened of the giants. But over time, she saw the way they moved slowly and deliberately, careful not to harm anything, even a small plant or the chickens that wandered near. Grace, John's mother, watched from her garden, her eyes wide with awe, yet her heart warmed at the idea that these powerful beings could exist without causing fear or harm. There were other mysteries, too. Tools and small items that went missing from the house would reappear in unexpected places. The twins seemed to be curious about everything: water, fire, the way sunlight shifted across the land, and even the sound of wind through the trees. John found himself explaining simple things to them, as if they were students of life, and sometimes it felt as though they were teaching him as well. Their silence was a language of its own, a presence that could not be described in words, but one he had learned to feel. One evening, as the sun sank below the horizon, John decided to take a short walk with them along the dry creek. He was cautious, aware of their immense size, yet the twins followed him willingly. The desert stretched out in every direction, vast and endless, and the sky turned from orange to deep purple, stars beginning to twinkle like scattered diamonds. John felt a deep connection to the land that day, as though the earth itself had become alive with the presence of these giants. During the walk, the smaller twin bent down and picked up a small stone, turning it over in his enormous hand. Then, with surprising delicacy, he placed it on a flat rock near the creek, alongside several others. John knelt to examine the arrangement. It seemed deliberate, a pattern, a message, though he could not understand its meaning. And yet, he felt the intention behind it, the care, the thoughtfulness. The giants were expressing themselves in ways that transcended words, and John realized that this was how trust deepened, through shared understanding, through patience, and through presence. Back at the ranch, John continued his chores, but the twins' quiet influence was everywhere. They moved silently at first, helping without asking, their enormous hands lifting fallen fences, guiding stray cattle, and even carrying water to the trough when John was occupied. He could not imagine their strength, their power, yet they chose to use it gently, carefully, always aware of the fragile balance of life around them. John felt both humbled and inspired. As days turned into nights, John began to notice something even more remarkable. The twins were forming routines, patterns that mirrored his own life. They would appear near the creek in the early morning, observe the sunrise with him, and retreat to the shade near the house in the afternoons. At night, they would gather near the fire, listening to the crackle and warmth, as though participating in his life without interfering. John realized that these beings of legend had become part of his world, not as visitors, but as companions, silently acknowledging the trust and kindness he had shown them. One particularly quiet evening, the twins whispered to each other again. John could not understand the words, but he felt the emotion behind them. Gratitude, yes, but also something more profound, a desire for connection, a recognition that they had found safety and, perhaps, friendship with a simple, humble man. John felt a lump in his throat. He had never imagined that his small acts of kindness could reach beings so vast, so strong, yet so capable of tenderness. That night John lay awake in his small room listening to the desert wind. The stars shone brightly, and for the first time he felt a true sense of wonder. He understood that life was larger than the hardships of a poor rancher. There were mysteries, there were connections, and there were beings beyond imagination who could walk quietly alongside him, shaping his world with their presence. He thought of the twins often, imagining them moving silently through the desert, observing and learning, yet always returning to the ranch. He felt their loyalty and curiosity as tangible things, almost as if he could reach out and touch them in the air. And though he was a simple man used to struggle and solitude, he realized he had been chosen in some way, chosen to witness and care for beings who were extraordinary, yet deeply in need of trust and understanding. John knew, as he drifted into sleep, that his life had changed. The desert, once harsh and unforgiving, now felt alive with possibility. The twins, enormous and gentle, were not just visitors passing through. They had come into his life to stay, and with them, they brought a sense of magic, a sense of wonder, and a bond that could not be explained with words. In the quiet desert night, as the wind whispered softly through the rocks and bushes, John felt a profound truth. The giants were not just watching over him, and he was not just helping them. They were forming a connection that was mutual, a bond built on trust, respect, and kindness. And in that bond, John discovered something he had never truly known, that life, even in its simplest, hardest form, could be extraordinary. The night was quiet, almost impossibly still. The desert stretched out in all directions, dark and vast, with only the silver glow of the moon to illuminate the sparse landscape. Stars sparkled overhead, countless and bright, casting faint reflections on the rocks and sand. For most people, this night would have seemed ordinary, serene even. But for John Calder, it was about to become extraordinary. He had finished his chores for the evening, the small fire outside crackling and giving off a warm, comforting light. The twins had been unusually silent that day, observing him from a distance, their immense forms barely moving. John had grown used to their presence, yet tonight he sensed something different, a shift in the air, a quiet tension that made his heart beat a little faster. It was as if the desert itself were holding its breath. John glanced at the twins. They were standing together near the edge of the ranch, just where the dry creek met a small rise of rocks. He could see their outlines clearly in the moonlight, their enormous shoulders and limbs casting long shadows across the ground. The taller twin stepped forward, and the smaller one followed, moving with a grace that belied their size. They were not approaching aggressively, there was no threat in their movement, but the sheer magnitude of their presence made John pause, feeling both awe and anticipation. "Are you coming closer?" he asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. The taller twin inclined his head, and slowly, carefully, they moved toward the fire. Their shadows stretched across the ground like mountains, yet there was a gentle rhythm to their steps. When they were finally near, John could see them fully for the first time in the moonlight. They were enormous, yes, taller than any man he had ever seen, with broad shoulders and powerful arms. But there was something human in their features, something familiar in the shape of their faces, the depth of their eyes. They were both strong and gentle at the same time, a combination that left John in awe. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The twins simply stood there, watching him with eyes that seemed to see far beyond the ordinary. John felt a mix of emotions: fear, wonder, curiosity, and something he could only describe as reverence. He realized that these beings, who had once been legends whispered about in stories, were now part of his reality. And yet, despite their size and strength, they were vulnerable in ways he could feel. Their trust in him, their willingness to stay near him, was a quiet, profound gift. Finally, the taller twin spoke, his voice low and deep, resonating like distant thunder, yet soft enough not to frighten. "You saved us," he said simply. "Few humans would do what you did. You have kindness. You have courage." John felt a lump in his throat. "I didn't do it for praise," he said. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. No one deserves to be trapped and hurt." The smaller twin stepped closer, their enormous hands almost brushing John's shoulders, careful not to harm him. We wish," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly, "to be together with you, always. Not as strangers, not as myths, but as companions." John's heart pounded so hard he feared they could hear it. He had expected many things: wonder, awe, perhaps even fear. But this was something he had never imagined. They were not asking for help now. They were offering something far more profound: trust, friendship, and a bond that transcended ordinary understanding. He swallowed, unsure if words could capture what he felt. "Together?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "You mean stay here?" The twins nodded slowly, as if agreeing that words were sufficient but not necessary. Their eyes held something deeper, something that did not need explanation, an unspoken promise that this connection, once formed, could never be broken. John realized that they were not simply giants of legend. They were beings capable of loyalty, of gratitude, of emotion, and they had chosen him. The firelight flickered across their faces, highlighting the sharp lines of their features and the gentle softness of their expressions. John felt humbled. Here were beings of immense power, capable of moving mountains or striking fear into hearts. Yet they were silent, respectful, and patient. And they had come to him, not for protection, but for companionship. As the night deepened, John found himself sitting down near the fire, the twins settling into the shade close by, careful not to crowd him, but close enough that he could sense their warmth. He watched the way they moved, the way their eyes occasionally met his, communicating without words. Each gesture, each subtle motion, carried meaning. The twins had chosen him not because he was extraordinary, but because he had been kind and brave in a moment of need. And in that choice, John understood something profound. The smallest acts of goodness could ripple outward, creating connections that could change lives forever. Hours passed. The desert night was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of the wind and the distant cry of a coyote. John spoke softly to the twins, telling them about life on the ranch, about the hard days, the lonely nights, and the little joys of watching a calf take its first steps or a plant bloom in the garden. He did not know if they understood fully, but he felt that they did. The giants listened, their immense forms relaxed, yet every movement deliberate, their attention fully focused on him. At one point, the smaller twin reached out, placing a massive hand near John's. The gesture was careful, deliberate, respectful. John placed his hand against theirs, marveling at the enormity of it, the strength and gentleness coexisting in a single touch. He realized then that trust could take many forms. It could be quiet, subtle, and expressed through simple acts, staying nearby, listening, being present, and he knew that this night had forged a bond that would last a lifetime. The twins whispered again, their voices soft, almost musical. John could not understand every word, but he felt the emotion behind them. Gratitude, recognition, and something deeper, a desire for connection, a wish to remain together in a world that often felt harsh and lonely. John smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. He had never imagined that a poor rancher like himself could be part of something so extraordinary, so magical. And yet here he was. Time seemed to stretch. The fire dwindled to glowing embers, and the twins remained by his side, watching over him with quiet vigilance. John realized that the desert, which had once felt vast and isolating, now felt alive and protective. The giant's presence was not frightening. It was comforting. It was as if the earth itself had accepted him and his companions, and in that acceptance, he found peace. Eventually, John rose to stretch, glancing at the twins one last time before heading inside his small house. Their forms were immense in the moonlight, yet gentle, patient, and unthreatening. As he lay in bed that night, he could still feel their presence lingering, a quiet reassurance that he was not alone. For the first time in years, he felt truly safe and deeply connected to the world around him. Sleep came slowly, but even in dreams, the twins were there, watching over him, moving silently through the desert, and whispering in voices that carried care, loyalty, and friendship. John awoke the next morning with a sense of wonder that he had never known. The world seemed brighter, the sun warmer, and the land more alive. He understood now that life was not just about survival, work, and struggle. It was also about connection, trust, and the magic that could arise when kindness met courage. That night had been a revelation, a moment when the extraordinary and the ordinary intersected. John had seen the giants for what they truly were, not myths or legends, but beings capable of love, loyalty, and gentle care. And they had chosen him, a poor rancher, as their companion. The thought was overwhelming, humbling, and yet filled him with joy. In the quiet of the desert, under the silver moon and the sparkling stars, John realized a profound truth. The bonds we form, even in unexpected ways, can be life-changing. The giants had whispered their wish to him, not as a command, but as an offering of trust and connection. And in that offering, John found a new sense of purpose and wonder. For John Calder, the poor rancher, the night had brought revelation, companionship, and a promise that life, even in its hardest moments, could hold magic, mystery, and relationships beyond imagination. And he knew, deep in his heart, that the journey he had begun with the twins was only just starting. Morning came quietly to John Calder's ranch, though the day felt different than any he had ever experienced. The desert was alive with the gentle hum of life, birds calling, the soft rustle of winds through the dry brush, and the distant sound of the creek as it trickled through the rocks. John woke to the faint, comforting presence of the giants. They were still there, watching over him, silent but attentive, as though they had become part of the rhythm of his life. He rose slowly, stepping outside into the warm sunlight. The twins were waiting near the edge of the property, their immense forms outlined against the bright sky. John had grown used to seeing them, yet each morning he felt the same awe, the same sense that life had expanded beyond anything he had imagined. He moved toward them, cautious but confident, and they greeted him with quiet nods. There was no need for words. Their presence itself was enough. The morning chores felt lighter now, though the work was still hard. Feeding the cattle, carrying water, repairing fences. Each task that once weighed heavily on him now carried a sense of purpose he had never felt before. The twins helped, though not in ways that were obvious or intrusive. Sometimes, John would glance back and see a giant carefully moving a fallen fence post or guiding a stray cow back to the pen. Their help was quiet, deliberate, and always gentle, never forceful. It was as though they were teaching him the art of living with both strength and kindness. As the days passed, word of strange happenings at the ranch began to spread among the nearby villagers. Stories circulated of the enormous figures seen at night, moving silently, yet never harming a person, animal, or even a plant. Some were skeptical, dismissing the tales as imagination or exaggeration. Others were curious, watching from a distance, wondering if the legends of the Apache giants were true. John never encouraged these stories. He was not concerned with fame or attention. The twins were not showpieces. They were friends, companions, and guardians. John noticed small changes in the ranch itself. The crops in his garden seemed to flourish, even in the dry soil. The water troughs stayed full, the fences remained strong, and the cattle grew healthier. It was as though the land had responded to the twins' presence, or perhaps to the care and attention John had put into everything he touched. Life, he realized, was not only about survival, but about nurturing, about harmony between humans, nature, and the extraordinary beings that sometimes walked quietly among them. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, John and the twins sat near the fire. The air was warm yet soft, filled with the scent of sagebrush and the quiet energy of the desert night. The twins were relaxed, their massive forms curling near the edge of the firelight, yet their eyes remained focused on him. John spoke softly, telling them about small events in the village, the simple joys of life, and even the hardships he had faced growing up on the ranch. They listened intently, as though absorbing each word, learning not just about his life, but about the human world itself. It was in these quiet moments that John understood the depth of their bond. They were not merely protectors or observers. They were friends, companions who had chosen to walk alongside him in life. Their whispers at night, the soft movements in the desert, the deliberate gestures of kindness, all of it was part of a language beyond words. John had come to trust them completely, and they had come to trust him. It was a connection that required no explanations, no agreements, only mutual respect and care. One morning, a young calf had gotten stuck near the creek, struggling to free itself from the uneven rocks. John ran toward it, but before he could reach the animal, the smaller twin arrived, moving with a speed that belied his size. Carefully, he lifted the calf with enormous hands, placing it gently on stable ground. John watched, amazed, feeling a mixture of awe and gratitude. The giants were powerful, yes, but they chose to use their strength with care, never recklessly, always mindful of life's fragility. That afternoon, John's sister, Lucy, approached him with wide eyes. She had grown accustomed to the giant's presence, yet she was still cautious. "John," she said softly, they care for us, don't they?" John nodded. "Yes," he replied. "They care, and they've chosen to stay with us. They're part of our lives now." Lucy smiled, a mixture of wonder and relief on her face. Grace, their mother, watched from her garden, shaking her head in quiet amazement. Life on the ranch was hard, yes, but it was filled with extraordinary moments now. Moments that no money, fame, or power could buy. Days turned into weeks, and John found that he could no longer imagine life without the twins. Their presence had transformed not only the ranch but also his heart. The fear and isolation that had once defined his life were replaced with courage, companionship, and a quiet joy he had never known. He spoke to them often, telling them about dreams he had, stories from his childhood, and the hopes he carried for the future. They listened, sometimes responding with gestures, sometimes simply watching, but always offering a sense of presence and understanding that words alone could not convey. The twins themselves began to show signs of affection and trust in subtle ways. One morning, John woke to find the smaller twin sitting near the porch, tracing patterns in the dirt that resembled symbols he had seen in old books about Apache culture. The taller twin had collected firewood, stacking it neatly near the house, ensuring that John would have warmth for the night. These gestures, though simple, carried meaning, a quiet promise that they were part of his life, committed to sharing their strength and care with him. One evening, as a gentle breeze swept across the desert, John and the twins watched the sunset together. The sky was painted in deep shades of purple, orange, and gold, the clouds catching the last light of day. John felt a deep sense of peace. He realized that life, even with its struggles and hardships, could hold moments of beauty and magic beyond imagination. The twins had not only protected him and his family, but had brought him a sense of wonder that he had never thought possible. Time passed, and the bond between John and the giants grew even stronger. The twins became integral to the ranch, helping in ways that were subtle yet profound. They guided the cattle, moved large obstacles, and even assisted John in preparing the land for planting. Yet, despite their power, they remained gentle, careful not to disrupt the balance of life around them. John understood that their true gift was not merely strength, but wisdom, the wisdom to use their power responsibly and with kindness. One night, as John lay in bed, he reflected on all that had happened. He thought about the day he first found the twins trapped in the net, about the courage it had taken to help them, and about the trust that had blossomed between them. He realized that this connection had changed him in ways he could not fully describe. He was no longer just a poor rancher struggling to survive. He was a friend, a companion, and a caretaker for beings extraordinary beyond imagination. And in return, they had transformed his world, filling it with safety, wonder, and love. As he drifted into sleep, John felt the twins' presence around him, a quiet comfort that filled the room. He knew that they would always be near, guiding, protecting, and sharing in his life. The desert night was alive with their presence, and he could feel the deep bond that had formed, a bond built on trust, kindness, and the courage to act when it mattered most. In the days that followed, the ranch flourished more than ever before. Crops grew tall and strong, the cattle were healthy, and the small house seemed brighter and warmer. The villagers, curious and sometimes cautious, came to respect the mysterious protectors who lived quietly at the ranch's edge. And John Calder, the poor rancher who had once struggled to keep his land alive, now thrived with companions who were extraordinary, yet gentle and loyal. Evenings became times of quiet reflection, where John, Lucy, Grace, and the twins would sit near the fire, sharing warmth and presence without needing words. The giant's whispers, soft and musical, carried across the desert night, a reminder of the trust and companionship that had formed. And in those moments, John understood the greatest truth of all. Life's true wealth was not in money, power, or possessions, but in connections, kindness, and bonds that could transcend the ordinary. John often looked at the twins and thought about the incredible journey they had taken together. From the moment he freed them from the hunter's net to the nights spent by the fire sharing silent conversations, he realized that courage, empathy, and simple acts of kindness could create miracles. He had saved the giants, yes, but they had saved him in return. From loneliness, from despair, and from a life limited to mere survival. The twins whispered once more that night, not in words John could fully understand, but in emotions he could feel gratitude, trust, and a desire to remain together. John smiled, closing his eyes, and felt a profound sense of peace. He had found companionship that was rare, magical, and enduring, a bond that would last for as long as the desert winds whispered across the plains. Life on the ranch continued, full of hard work, beauty, and wonder. The giants remained by John's side, sharing in the joys and struggles of everyday life, but always with a quiet presence that reminded him that kindness and trust could create bonds beyond imagination.